Let's talk about smoking now, since this is the method most people have heard of, but rarely understand the actual mechanics behind. Smoking works through two separate effects happening at the same time. First, the heat from a low, slow fire continues drying the meat, removing even more moisture beyond what salting already accomplished. Second, the smoke itself deposits natural compounds onto the meat's surface that actively resist bacteria and mold growth. This is why smoking almost always follows salting rather than replacing it. Salt removes internal moisture. Smoke adds a protective, antibacterial layer on top and finishes drying the outer surface completely. Together, they accomplish something neither method achieves as well on its own. Amish farms built simple smokehouses, small wooden or stone structures separate from the main house, specifically for this purpose. You don't need anything this elaborate to smoke meat safely at home today. But understanding the basic principle helps you build something that works. The fire used for smoking needs to stay low and cool, ideally between 100 degrees and 160 degrees. This is not cooking heat. This is drying and flavoring heat. A fire that gets too hot cooks the meat instead of preserving it, which changes the texture completely and doesn't provide the same benefit. Hardwoods work best for this kind of smoking. Hickory, applewood, and oak were the most common choices on Amish farms. These trees grew locally and produced a steady, clean smoke without the bitter, harsh taste that softer woods like pine can leave behind. Never use pine, cedar, or any resinous softwood for smoking meat. These woods contain compounds that create a bitter, chemical-tasting result, and some produce smoke that isn't safe for direct food contact. For a simple home setup, a large metal drum or an old filing cabinet, modified with a small fire pit, recreates the same basic principle. The meat needs to hang or sit with space around every surface. The same airflow principle from dry aging beef. Smoke needs to reach every side evenly, and moisture needs somewhere to escape as it's drawn out by gentle heat and salt. For a whole ham or a large cut, smoking typically continues for 8 to 12 hours. Traditional methods extended this over several days, with the fire tended continuously and kept at that same low, steady temperature. For smaller cuts, 4 to 6 hours is often enough, since there's less mass for the smoke and heat to penetrate. You'll know smoking is complete when the meat's surface turns a deep mahogany color and feels firm and slightly tacky. Let's talk about combining salting and smoking. This combination is how bacon was traditionally made on Amish farms. Start with a pork belly, salted using the dry salt method for about 7 days. Belly meat is thinner and cures faster. Rinse off the excess surface salt after this curing period. Pat the belly completely dry. Then smoke it using the low, steady heat method for 4 to 6 hours. What comes out is bacon in its traditional, shelf-stable form. Let's talk about jerky next. It's one of the oldest and simplest methods, requiring the least equipment. For jerky, slice lean meat into thin strips, about 1/4 inch thick, cutting against the grain. Salt these strips lightly. A light, even coating on both sides is enough, since preservation comes primarily from drying. Hang these strips somewhere with good airflow and low humidity, away from direct sunlight. Drying time typically takes 3 to 5 days. The meat is done when it bends without breaking, but shows no visible moisture. Properly dried jerky lasts for months at room temperature, stored in a cloth bag that allows airflow. Combining smoking with drying for jerky produces a longer-lasting, more flavorful result than air drying alone. The gentle heat speeds up the drying process significantly, while the smoke adds an additional layer of preservation. In the next part, I want to cover root cellar storage, which relies on the natural properties of the earth itself to keep meat safe. An Amish family can hang a whole hog in November and still be eating that same meat in July, with no fridge, no freezer, no electricity at all. My name is Samuel Mast. I farmed 200 acres of Amish land in Millersburg, Ohio, for 30 years. We raised our own animals. We preserved every pound of meat we harvested, with no electricity anywhere on the property. We never lost a single cut to spoilage in 30 years. I left my community and watched my neighbors throw away meat because power went out. Today, I'm telling you everything. Modern kitchens treat refrigeration like the only way meat survives. This is a recent idea. Refrigerators became common in American homes less than 100 years ago. Meat preservation itself goes back thousands of years. Amish families never had a single refrigerator on the farm. Not because they couldn't afford one, but because they never needed one. Every method used instead was older, cheaper, and more reliable, since none of it depended on a machine that could break down. There are 4 main methods: salting, smoking, drying, and root cellar storage. Each one suits a different type of meat or season. Let's start with salting, since it's the foundation almost every other method builds on top of. Salt pulls moisture out through osmosis. Bacteria need moisture to survive and multiply. Remove enough moisture, and bacteria simply cannot grow, no matter how long meat sits. This is chemistry that's worked the same way for thousands of years, long before anyone understood the science behind why it worked. For a whole ham, use 1 pound of coarse salt for every 25 pounds of meat. This is a functional coating to draw moisture. Rub this salt into every surface by hand, working it into folds, seams, or exposed bone areas where bacteria tend to concentrate. Place the salted meat on a clean wooden surface or hang it in a cool space, ideally between 36 and 40 degrees. This is the biggest advantage salting has over refrigeration. It doesn't need a constant, precise temperature to stay safe. Over 2 to 3 weeks, salt draws liquid out. You'll see moisture pooling, sometimes referred to as brine, forming naturally. After the initial heavy salting period, brush off the excess salt. What's left is hostile to bacteria and stable at room temperature. This process is how ham became a Christmas tradition. A hog slaughtered in November was ready and safely preserved by the holidays. Let's talk about dry salt curing versus wet brining. Dry salting works best for larger cuts like whole hams or thick bacon. Wet brining uses a saltwater solution, typically 1 cup of salt dissolved into 1 gallon of water, with a little sugar added. Wet brining works faster and suits smaller cuts like chicken or fish. A few days achieves similar preservation to weeks of dry salt. Amish households used both methods. Slaughter season was busy, and having 2 methods meant every animal could be processed efficiently. Use coarse salt, labeled pickling or canning salt, rather than table salt. Table salt contains iodine, which can interfere with curing. A single large bag of coarse salt cures far more meat than most households process in a year, and it's very affordable. Undersalting is the most common failure. People worry about the taste, so they use less salt, but this creates meat that spoils. The ratio I gave you isn't a suggestion. It's the minimum for the chemistry to work. Excess salt gets rinsed away before cooking. This salting foundation is the starting point for everything else. Smoking builds directly on top of a properly salted piece of meat. Let's talk about root cellar storage now. Since this method works completely differently from everything covered so far, salting and smoking change the meat itself. Root cellar storage, instead, relies entirely on the natural properties of the earth to create conditions bacteria cannot thrive in. A root cellar is simply a space dug into the ground, or built partially underground, taking advantage of one basic fact. Several feet below the surface, soil temperature stays remarkably stable year-round, regardless of what's happening above ground. This stability is the entire secret behind why this method worked for centuries without any mechanical cooling at all. In most parts of Ohio and across the northern United States, ground temperature 4 to 6 feet down stays between 50 and 55 degrees consistently. This isn't as cold as a modern refrigerator, but it's cold enough to dramatically slow bacterial growth, especially when combined with preserved meat. Amish farms built root cellars either as a separate dug structure near the house or as a walled-off section of an existing basement. The key design element in every version was minimizing any connection to outside air temperature, keeping that space as close to true ground temperature as possible. A properly built root cellar has thick walls, often stone or packed earth, minimal window space, and a door that seals reasonably well. Some airflow is actually necessary, since a completely sealed space traps humidity and encourages mold. But that airflow needs to be gentle and controlled. For meat storage specifically, root cellars worked best as a secondary stage, after salting or smoking had already been done. Fresh, unsalted meat placed directly in a root cellar without any prior treatment still spoils within days, since 50 degrees alone isn't cold enough. It was one part of a complete system, working alongside salting and smoking, not replacing them entirely. Cured hams could hang in a root cellar for months, continuing to lose small amounts of moisture slowly in that cool, stable environment. Smoked meats stored the same way, benefiting from antibacterial compounds and the consistently cool temperature preventing moisture from supporting new bacterial growth. Let's talk about how meat was actually positioned inside a root cellar, since this mattered as much as the temperature itself. Meat was always hung, never stacked directly on shelves or the floor. Hanging kept air moving around every surface, preventing trapped moisture. Meat was also kept separate from root vegetables. Vegetables release moisture and ethylene gas as they age, which can speed up meat spoilage. Slaughter happened in late fall, typically November. Because the coming winter provided naturally cold conditions both outside and within the root cellar. By early spring, most root cellar meat supplies were significantly reduced, having fed the family through the coldest months. An unused corner of an existing basement can be adapted with relatively simple materials. Wall off a section using insulated panels. If you don't have a basement, a smaller option involves burying a large container, like a repurposed chest freezer, in the ground outside. Place a simple thermometer inside, checking it weekly. If you notice significant swings, this usually points to a gap or leak. Humidity matters too. Too dry, and hanging meat loses moisture too fast. A simple bowl of water helps raise humidity if your cellar runs dry. No electricity touched any part of this process, from the day an animal was slaughtered to the day that meat was finally eaten. Now that we've covered salting, smoking, and root cellar storage individually, it's time to see how Amish families combined all three. This is where most modern explanations fall short. People often treat these methods as separate techniques, choosing one or another depending on preference. But, historically, that isn't how Amish farms worked. They weren't looking for individual preservation tricks. They were building an entire year's food supply. The process always began with timing. Slaughter season was never random. Families planned it carefully around the weather. Late November through early January offered ideal conditions. Cold temperatures were one of the most valuable tools they had. Daytime temperatures kept freshly butchered meat from spoiling, while nighttime freezes gave families extra time to process every cut properly. Today, refrigeration solves this automatically. But for Amish families, the weather itself became their temporary refrigerator while the preservation process began. As soon as the animal was butchered, the work divided naturally. Nothing was wasted. Every cut already had a purpose. Large hams were trimmed for curing. Bacon slabs were prepared separately. Shoulders and thicker muscles were selected for smoking. Bones were saved for soup, and fat was rendered into lard. This organization was efficiency developed through generations of experience. The first stage was almost always salt. Large wooden boxes and stone crocks were prepared days beforehand. Each piece of meat received generous amounts of coarse salt, especially around joints and bone openings, where moisture escaped slowly. Layer after layer, meat disappeared beneath heavy blankets of salt. For weeks, the salt quietly did its work, removing moisture. The meat became firmer, drier, and more stable. Families checked the containers regularly to ensure no excess liquid collected. No electricity, no machines, just observation. Once curing reached the proper stage, many cuts moved directly to the smokehouse. Smoking strengthened the preservation process while adding another protective layer. Inside, hardwood fires burned slowly for days. The goal was never intense heat. Families maintained cool, continuous smoke oak, hickory, or maple that gently surrounded every piece. Too much heat melted fat. Too little smoke reduced effectiveness. Maintaining that balance became an art passed down through generations. When smoking finished, the surface had darkened. The texture became firmer, and the meat was even better protected against spoilage. Only then did the final stage begin. The root cellar, here. The work shifted from preserving meat to maintaining it. Every ham and slab of bacon was hung from sturdy wooden beams. Nothing touched the floor or the damp walls. Air needed to circulate around every surface. Outside, the seasons changed, but underground, the temperature changed very little. Salt reduced moisture. Smoke added protective compounds. The root cellar slowed biological processes. Together, they formed a complete system. Modern people imagine this meat was forgotten until needed. In reality, families monitored their stored food constantly, checking for mold or odors. Problems weren't ignored, they were caught early. This routine inspection explains why spoilage remained surprisingly uncommon on well-managed farms. Nothing was random. Every piece had its place. Bacon used regularly often came down months earlier than hams reserved for special occasions. Highly cured meat was soaked before cooking to reduce excess salt. A single smoked ham could season multiple meals across several days. Amish families planned food for an entire year. Success depended on patience, observation, and discipline rather than technology. Instead of fighting nature, they worked with it. Every season served a purpose. Every method complemented another. Next, we'll examine what today's world can learn from these traditional methods. Separating timeless food science from common myths. After seeing how Amish families combined salting, smoking, and root cellar storage into one complete preservation system, it's easy to assume these methods belonged only to the past. We often think of them as historical techniques that disappeared the moment electricity arrived. But the truth is far more interesting. The science behind these methods has never become outdated. Only the technology has changed. Every modern refrigerator, every commercial smokehouse, every dry aging room, and every professional curing facility still relies on exactly the same biological principles that Amish families understood generations ago. The equipment may look different. The temperatures may be controlled electronically. Humidity may be monitored by digital sensors instead of experience. Air circulation may come from electric fans rather than carefully designed ventilation. But the underlying science remains exactly the same. Bacteria still need moisture. Temperature still determines how quickly microorganisms multiply. Salt still reduces available water inside food. Smoke still deposits protective compounds onto meat. Airflow still prevents excess moisture from collecting. Time still changes food in predictable ways. Nature has never rewritten those rules. Humans have simply developed more convenient ways to control them. That realization is perhaps the most remarkable part of this entire story. The Amish were not preserving meat through mysterious traditions or forgotten secrets. They were applying practical observations passed down through generations. Long before microbiologists discovered bacteria, long before scientists understood water activity, long before laboratories explained preservation chemically, farmers already knew what worked. Not because they understood every scientific mechanism, but because experience had taught them the results. Generation after generation refined the process. If one technique failed, families remembered. If another proved reliable, it became tradition. Over decades, then centuries, those observations evolved into one of the most dependable food preservation systems, developed without electricity. Today, modern science has largely confirmed why those methods worked. Researchers now understand that bacteria require available moisture to reproduce efficiently. Food scientists refer to this as water activity. Lower the available moisture enough, and microbial growth slows dramatically. Salt accomplishes this naturally by drawing water away from microorganisms and reducing the moisture available within the meat itself. Smoke contributes additional preservation by depositing natural compounds that inhibit the growth of certain bacteria and molds while also drying the surface. Cool temperatures reduce microbial activity even further. Air circulation helps keep surfaces dry. Humidity influences how quickly moisture leaves the meat. Every piece fits together like parts of a carefully engineered system. None of these discoveries changed Amish practices. Instead, they explained why those practices had succeeded for centuries. This is one reason traditional food preservation continues attracting scientific interest today. Researchers recognize that many historical techniques were built upon accurate observations of natural processes, even if the people using them lacked modern scientific vocabulary. Of course, that does not mean every old method should be copied exactly. Modern food safety standards exist for good reasons. Scientists now understand microorganisms that earlier generations could not see. We know about pathogens capable of causing serious illness. We understand cross-contamination. We understand precise temperature ranges. We understand sanitation at a level unavailable to previous centuries. Because of this knowledge, anyone interested in traditional preservation should combine historical techniques with modern food safety guidance rather than relying solely on historical practice. That approach respects both tradition and science. In many ways, this combination represents the best of both worlds. The wisdom of generations, supported by modern microbiology, traditional craftsmanship, verified through scientific research, old techniques, new understanding. Perhaps the greatest lesson Amish preservation offers isn't actually about meat at all. It's about mindset. Modern society has become remarkably dependent upon continuous electricity. Most households keep only a few days of food that can survive without refrigeration. Power outages lasting several days often create immediate concern. Yet for generations, families built complete food systems that remained functional without electrical power, that required planning, discipline, patience, knowledge, and above all, an understanding that preserving food begins long before storage. It begins with timing, with preparation, with choosing the correct method for each type of food. Every decision affected the months ahead. There was no emergency trip to the supermarket if something spoiled. No freezer packed with replacement meat. Success depended upon doing each step correctly. That level of responsibility shaped daily life. Children learned preservation by helping adults. Teenagers gradually accepted larger responsibilities. Skills passed naturally from one generation to the next, not through textbooks, but through participation. By adulthood, many Amish men and women had already observed dozens of complete preservation seasons. They understood the subtle signs that experience teaches. The feel of properly cured meat, the smell of clean hardwood smoke, the appearance of healthy drying, the importance of patience. These details became part of everyday life. Today, many of those traditions continue within Amish communities, even while modern society has largely forgotten them. Not because refrigeration failed, but because convenience replaced necessity. Electricity made food preservation easier, faster, more predictable. Yet it also reduced the need to understand the natural processes behind it. Most people simply adjust a thermostat. They never stop to consider why refrigeration works. Traditional preservation encourages a different perspective. It reminds us that food is biological. Living tissue begins changing immediately after harvest. Every preservation method simply manages those natural changes. Some methods use cold, Some use salt, some use smoke, some use drying. Some combine several approaches together, different techniques. Same scientific goal: control the conditions that microorganisms need in order to grow. When viewed this way, Amish preservation becomes far less mysterious. It becomes an elegant example of applied biology. Simple tools, natural materials, careful observation, consistent routines, and remarkable results. Even in today's technologically advanced world, there is something deeply impressive about a system capable of preserving food for months, using nothing more than knowledge, patience, and the resources available on the farm itself. Perhaps that explains why these methods continue fascinating people. Not because they reject modern technology, but because they demonstrate what human beings can accomplish through careful observation of nature. They remind us that science did not begin inside laboratories. It began in fields, in workshops, in kitchens, in smokehouses, where ordinary people spent generations learning from experience. And although modern production has transformed how we eat, the principles remain true. The earth still maintains stable temperatures beneath its surface. Salt still draws moisture from meat. Smoke still contains naturally protective compounds. Air still carries moisture away. Bacteria still respond to their environment. Nature continues following the same rules. The Amish simply learned how to work with those rules long before anyone could explain them scientifically. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson. Sometimes the most remarkable technologies aren't machines at all. Sometimes they're systems of knowledge, refined over generations, quietly proving that careful observation, patience, and respect for nature can accomplish extraordinary things.